Hello, and welcome to the third discussion event in the Sustainability First series, Together for a Fair Climate Future. This series considers the relationship between the climate crisis and fairness in society. Our first event set out visions for a more sustainable future and how to engage a diversity of voices in conversations about the UK's climate response. The second event considered what we value in society and how the COVID experience may have changed what we view as important. This third event today, How Can We Live More Sustainably, considers the impact we have as individuals on the environment and on each other. How can we make this impact positive, and the link between what we do as individuals and wider systems change, including by government and businesses. At the end of the event, we'll tell you more about our wider activities, including the 2021 Sustainability First Art and Writing Prizes. This programme of work will feed into the International UN Climate Conference. We're grateful to National Grid for sponsoring this work as a principal partner for the COP conference. Today's event is being streamed live to YouTube. Please do share your questions and comments in the chat. My colleague Sonia will join the YouTube discussion and feed some of your questions to us during the event. But please be aware that the panel can't see the chat directly as we're live streaming to Zoom. The event has captions and we'll be tweeting with the hashtag #FairClimateFuture. We all have an impact on people and the environment through the things we buy and what we do in our day-to-day lives, such as our food, our clothes, electronic goods, travel, and the energy and water that we use in our homes and our businesses and schools. These activities can contribute to climate change, as well as habitat loss, pollution, as well as impacting people's livelihoods, both in the UK and around the world through global supply chains. Today, we're focusing on the UK, whilst recognising our impacts overseas. The pandemic has made this global interconnectedness even more apparent, showing how individual actions can make a difference and the need for governments to show leadership and businesses to act responsibly. We're in a unique moment in history as things open up, the opportunity to rebuild our lives differently. And this event is also very timely, because today the government has trailed announcements that it will be bringing forward the UK's own climate targets. That's very welcome news, but how are we going to do it? The event will be in two parts. First of all, we'll look at what we as individuals can do to live more sustainably. And then we'll look at how we bring about wider systems changes to really have an impact for climate and fairness in the future. I'm Sharon Darcy, and I'm the Director of Sustainability First. Sustainability First is a think tank and charity that promotes practical solutions to improve social, environmental, and economic well-being. We've got a fantastic panel here today. They'll be sharing their wider perspectives, as well as short videos, which will give us an even wider view. So let's meet the panel. First off, I'd like to introduce Alice. Alice, would you like to tell us a bit about yourself and your journey in terms of how you got to where you are today?
Hi Sharon, thank you for that. So my name is Alice Farrell and I work at the Behavioural Insights team, which is a social purpose company which applies insights from psychology, economics and behavioural science to inform policy and improve public services. So I've worked at BIT for nearly 3 years, and I specialise in encouraging pro-environmental behaviours like recycling, sustainable transport and food consumption. I wanted to work in behavioural science because I think if we want to address the climate crisis, it's really important to understand the practical barriers people face to carrying out pro-environmental behaviours day to day. So I think we need to speak to people to better understand their perspectives and think about how we can redesign processes and systems so that eco-friendly choices feel easy and intuitive. And I feel that behavioural science is a really impactful lens to achieve that through.
Thank you very much, Alice. Angela, would you like to say hello and tell us a little bit about your background?
Certainly. Hi, everyone. So I'm an environmental scientist and I've been working in renewable energy and forestry for 20 years. I set up a social enterprise called One Home 3 years ago next week, actually, to talk to the public about climate change and what it means to them, their lives and their livelihoods, but crucially what they can do to tackle the issue, both in terms of reducing their carbon pollution and also adapting to the extreme weather events. I don't know about you, but I was outside for my lunch today. It is boiling hot out there in April. The weather's changing, and so as well as changing how we power and fuel our homes, we also need to get ready for more flooding and hot weather. So that's how I came to set up One Home. And what triggered it was that all the work I was doing on solar farms and community-owned wind farms was getting harder and harder. And when I started to look for information on climate change to use for people, I found a lot of the information out there was completely inaccurate. So that's why I set up One Home, was to put the facts into the public domain, but do it in a way that doesn't make people switch off their TV or turn the page on the newspaper. So do it in a way that engages people.
Brilliant. Thank you, Angela. Jack, what about you? Tell us a bit about yourself.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm a policy analyst with Zero Waste Scotland. And Zero Waste Scotland is a not-for-profit organisation in Scotland set up to look at how we can tackle climate change through more sustainable consumption. And as part of my role, I work on developing sustainable policies in Scotland. And that's ranging from the likes of the carrier bag charge to charging on single-use cups to a range of different measures. And but I also work on running pilots and trials in Scotland, trying to change the way that communities and wider society can consume more sustainably and reduce our burden on the environment. And I think it's really important that we begin to understand the impacts of our consumption. So not just our consumption of energy and the fossil fuels associated with that, but our consumption of stuff, all the stuff in our houses and things we buy every day. What impact does that have on the environment, and how can we solve that, and how can we address that?
Thanks, Jack. That's great. Kareena, what about you? Do you want to say hello and tell us a bit about your journey? Kareena, I can't hear you. You're on mute.
Hello?
Hello. Hi, Kareena.
Hi. Yeah. Hi, I'm Kareena, and I'm a climate and social activist. I got my start in Climate Strike Leicester as part of the organisation team. And since then, I've been on the radio. I've worked with documentary teams. I've done activism in Belgium as well. And my sole focus when it comes to activism is how can we ensure climate justice while protecting disadvantaged and marginalized communities. And so, yeah.
That's brilliant. Welcome, Kareena. And we're also very pleased to be joined today by the artist William Bock. William, do you want to give a bit of a wave? Who's going to be our visual scribe for today, drawing illustrations to match our discussion. So welcome, everyone. Let's start with the impact we have as individuals on the environment and people and the actions each of us can take. We've got a few videos to kick us off to really help set the scene. So let's have a look at those first.
Hi, my name is Zead, and I'm here to give you my top tips on how you can live an eco-friendly life. My first tip for you is to reduce the amount of things that you buy. By instantly reducing the amount of things that you buy, you reduce the amount that you're going to waste. My second tip for you is to recycle whenever you can, especially with plastics. This is so to avoid them ending up into a landfill, but instead being repurposed into something new. My third tip for you is to use your voice. Tell people that we need to live more eco-friendly lives. And my fourth tip for you, seemed like a bit of a plug, is to buy my book called How to Fix the Planet When You're a Teenager. Although the title might suggest otherwise, this book is applicable to everyone, anyone, at any age.
Hello, my name is Arceo and I am a sculptor and installation artist. My practice revolves around the exploration of how human footprints manifest in the environment, specifically in water environments and liquid environments. And this exploration began back in the 90s while I was still at Camberwell College of Art. I was studying the way that the RLC evaporated, and while we was doing that, it was leaving footprints in the form of salt. Salt is the footprint that water leaves as it evaporates into the air, and within those salt crystals were contained traces that denote the presence of human interference with the environment. So my work since then has followed a path to reveal how the sounds of the present will become the sounds of future dust.
Hi, I'm Charlotte and I'm 17. I'm a young trustee for YPTE. One thing young people can do to make a difference is making change within their schools. And that could be trying to reduce their school's food waste, trying to reduce their school's paper waste, or even demanding a more renewable energy provider through means like a petition. Considering that there are over 24,000 primary and secondary schools in the UK, that would create a huge large-scale difference if even a few committed to sustainable actions like those. And secondly, young people have social media as a platform, which is crucial more so now than ever in the run-up to COP26, as the government is hyper-aware of their eco-friendly, sustainable image as a country. And we've seen the government listen more so now to people's complaints. For example, the Cumbrian coal mine that was set to open is now being reconsidered following online backlash, which means you should raise your concerns with the government's environmental plans more so now than ever to make a difference.
So Jen shared some sustainable lifestyle tips. Maria's artwork considers the human impact on the environment and things like plastic pollution. And Charlotte advocates for young people to make change within schools and use social media as a platform. So I'd now like to invite the panel members to discuss some of these really interesting perspectives with me. Perhaps we can start with Jack. Jack, how are we connected to the environment and other people through the things we buy and the way we live? And what are the consequences of that?
Well, I think it's fair to say we're deeply connected to the environment and other people through the things we buy, through the things we consume. In fact, 50% of the world's carbon emissions, all the emissions produced in the world, are directly linked to the extraction of the raw materials and processing materials for the stuff we buy, everything we have in our home, our cars. And on top of that, the consumption of all this stuff actually results in 90% of all global biodiversity loss. So we're really intrinsically linked to the environment through our stuff. But why is this the case? And I think a good example is take this phone, for example. To make this phone, we need to mine around 70 different raw materials across dozens of countries. And these are mostly developing countries, which have very relaxed social working laws and environmental laws. And these raw materials need to then be processed using a ton of energy to convert them into the materials that we can build the phone from. These materials are then shipped around the world with diesel guzzling ships, which are not only detrimental to the climate, but also to the ocean and wildlife in the oceans. Then all these things need to be put together in the phone and manufactured, which all takes energy, and then shipped to us. And then finally, when we finish with this phone, when it's died or its end of life has come to an end, we then need to get rid of this phone. And the sad fact is the majority of phones either end up in landfill, which kind of leach toxic chemicals into the environment, or they get sent abroad to developing countries where there's cheap labor for people to strip them apart, pull the batteries out. And most of the time, these people don't have access to safety equipment. They're touching toxic chemicals and are exposed to a whole range of different substances. So just through this example of our phone, we can see how intrinsically linked our consumption is, not only to impacting the environment, but also people's lives in other countries. And that's just one example of a phone. We can multiply that for our textiles, for our electronics, even the food we buy. So the best thing we can do, I would say, is just to consume less stuff. It's quite simple, actually. If you really do need to buy something, like a phone, just buy it secondhand. Buy a refurbished phone. Way smaller impact on the environment. It's cheaper for you, and you don't have 5-year-old children in Bangladesh pulling apart your phone for batteries. So there's some really simple things we can do. Hopefully, Sharon, that's a pretty simple example to show how our consumption is impacting the planet and people.
Thanks, Jack. That's a really powerful example. Angela, I wonder if we could move on to you. In her video, Jen shared some really practical tips. With your website and the work that you do, what recommendations would you share for sustainable living? And what are the most popular things that people come to you asking for advice on?
Yeah, so it's a brilliant question, because the key thing is what has the most impact. So there's an Analyst survey out today in the FT that shows that people love recycling, and that is their favorite activity to do around climate change, but it probably has the least impact in terms of reducing your carbon footprint. So it's about where are the real carbon emissions coming from in our lifetime, and it's from where we burn fossil fuels, our coal, oil and gas, in heating our homes and in driving our cars, and when we used to take long-haul flights, flying as well as the food and drink that we consume. So our most popular page on our website by far is how to insulate your home so it is warm and cozy. And the good thing about insulation is that it also helps you keep your house cool in the summer as well. So it's got double benefits. And it tends to have a payback of about 2 years. So it's a fantastic activity to be doing. And going back to your first question about how consumers can have an impact, there's a saying, I've forgotten who said it, but basically you get to vote once every 5 years for your politician, but every time you spend something, you get to vote to choose what sort of world you want to live in. So the power of your purse or your wallet is extremely impactful, because businesses are there to serve the consumer and politicians are there to serve their citizens. So really, I think the whole consumer activism and citizen engagement power is much greater than individuals sitting at home worrying about climate change really comprehend that it is.
That's a really good phrase. Citizens vote every so often, and then consumers are voting with their wallets every day. So definitely food for thought there. Alice, moving over to you, how do we ensure it's as easy and accessible as possible for everyone to make sustainable choices?
That's a great question, Sharon, and it's the kind of overarching question to the work that we do on sustainable behaviour at BITE. So I guess my answer to that would be that we need to start by really understanding people's experiences and day-to-day context. So rather than assuming that we know what's stopping people from following through with an environmentally friendly behaviour, we need to really work with people to understand what's stopping them and then help to remove those barriers. So, for example, we recently did a project with Wigan Council to encourage people to recycle more. And one assumption when we went in is that there might just be low motivation to cycle, or people aren't motivated to put the effort in. But when we actually spoke to people in Wigan, what we found out is that they hadn't actually even realised that Wigan offered food recycling, and they had a misconception that they didn't produce enough food waste for it to be worth recycling. So that's an example of where our assumption of what the barrier might be was actually wrong. And by speaking to people and hearing from them about their context, we understood it better. So with that in mind, we raised awareness that Wigan provides food recycling. So we put tags on black bins in Wigan, and the tags had prompts to remind people to order a food waste caddy so that they could recycle their food. And it also had a note reminding them that even a small amount of food waste is valuable to recycle. And this led to a 1,500% increase in the number of food caddies ordered. So by actually identifying the barriers to behaviour and addressing it specifically, we saw a change in the behaviour that we wanted to encourage. So I think we really need to understand the practical and psychological barriers that people face in real life, day to day. And people are very busy. Most people really do care about the environment, but they have lots of other demands on their time and attention. So it's the role of people who work in environment and sustainability policy to kind of make their lives easier and remove those barriers for them so that sustainable choices feel just easy and intuitive for them.
Thank you, that's brilliant. Kareena, over to you. What actions do you think individuals and communities can take to have the biggest positive impacts for climate change and social justice?
Well, I think the most important thing that we can do is really pressure the corporations and the government to make the change. As in reality, it's 70% of all global carbon emissions are caused by 100 companies. Therefore, we need to demand that the government put regulations to protect people and the planet, because not only is it unsustainable, all the practices that these corporations are doing, they're exploiting people and the workers and consumers as well. Most people don't really have a choice in where they can shop due to, economic reasons. And therefore, we need to be making sure that these cheaper options for people are ones which are sustainable and not exploiting, people across the world and in the Western world as well. And we are connected to each other and the environment by the things we buy. So the people who do have the privilege to make choices in the things they buy should be the ones who can live sustainably as they can, while supporting the right businesses who don't have exploitative practices.
Thank you, that's great. In the videos, we saw from Maria how she's using art to really press the case about pollution, and particularly plastic pollution. Kareena, I know you do some art, and Alice, you clearly understand behaviour change. I wonder if either of you had any thoughts on the role that art and creativity can play in terms of getting behaviour change. Kareena, do you want to come in first?
I think that's very interesting. In terms of art is a way that we can all connect to each other, and it's something which everyone can interpret something different in. So I suppose one way we can use art to show people what's going on is really, it's I think we can use it a lot in like more advertising and whatnot. We can focus a lot on photography and what role photography plays in making sustainable change. And that's, most sort of advertisements will showcase art in some way, so we need to use that as best as we can, really. And by like a lot of what I've seen quite a lot of people do is using actual wasted materials to make art out of that, to showcase, at the vast amount of waste that there is across the planet, and how you can make something beautiful with wasted materials, basically. And I think that's a really strong, powerful message.
Thank you, Kareena. Alice, what about from your perspective?
Yeah, so I completely agree with Kareena that art is an amazing tool to tell stories. And we find that telling stories is the best way to appeal to people's emotions and capture their imagination. And this is backed up by research. So there was one study where researchers presented participants with content about the environment, and some participants were presented this content as purely informational with kind of facts and statistics, and some were presented it as a story, so it had a narrative. And they found that participants who'd been told this content as a story were more likely to donate part of their payment for taking part in the study to an environment charity afterwards. So this shows that really art and creativity can bring to life what climate change actually means for us and others around us. And it can invoke an emotional reaction, which prompts us to change our behaviours and do what we can to make a difference. What I also think is interesting is I've started to see, and I might be a bit behind the times, I'm sure this has been happening for a long time, but I've become more aware of artists using their work to help us imagine a future where we have actually successfully addressed climate change and we've changed our way of life. I'm thinking about Naomi Klein's A Message to the Future video, where it was a kind of illustrated video of what the future might look like if we can overcome climate change. So I think art can also be a powerful tool for inspiration and helping us not to fall into despair and inaction, basically.
I think we absolutely need that positivity to drive change quite often. So you've all explained all sorts of different things we could do. How on earth do we prioritise where we should put our sort of focus our attentions to get more sustainable consumption and more sustainable lifestyles? What action would you each say should have the biggest impact? And where would your priorities for change be at the individual level? Jack, what would it be for you?
That's a tough question. I think the very first thing was to say, just try not to be overwhelmed by the situation. It's not your fault that we're in this mess, and take that load off your shoulders first and foremost. And sometimes it feels like everything needs to be changed all at once, and you kind of become paralyzed. So the more you can take that weight off your shoulder and the burden and just start to think positive about what the small changes you could do, the more likely you're going to be successful. But we kind of know, Angela pointed out really clearly, we know the really key things as individuals that we can do right now today. Changing our diet, eating a lot less meat, particularly red meat, eating seasonal and local, stopping flying, or at least significantly reducing your flying and taking holidays locally or by train, and buying less stuff. And that could be, for example, participating in local tool libraries, and the sharing economy, even use eBay, Gumtree, buy secondhand. And the important thing is, with these things that we can do today and have a huge impact, these don't need to be sacrifices to our lifestyles. In fact, for many years I've been trying to do this and stepping towards it. It's actually really enriched my lifestyle. Moving away from meat has meant my diet has expanded. I've got loads of different meals now, super tasty. Flying less meant I've explored way more of Scotland, which is an absolutely beautiful country. And buying less stuff, actually, by buying and selling things on Facebook Marketplace or Gumtree or eBay, I get to meet people in my local community and actually speak face to face and tell stories and swap items, and everything in my apartment now has a story behind it. And that's really enriched my life. And so we really got to think of these as not sacrifices, but opportunities to enrich and enhance our lifestyles and our communities.
Thank you, Jack. I think that's really inspiring. What about you, Angela? You've said sort of loft insulation is really important. Is that the priority for you, or is there another thing?
Yeah, so raise your voice, cut your footprint is the main motto, basically. So raising your voice, I always say, especially in the age of social media, it is so easy to make your voice, your concerns and what you're doing seen in a public way. And your local media, your local radio station, your local papers are always looking for contributors. So if you are doing stuff, then shout about it, basically. Tell your friends, tell your peers. It's when climate scientists are asked what's the most important thing, they almost unanimously say talking about climate change, because it's something that until a common problem becomes common knowledge, it remains a problem, basically. So the talking bit, the raising your voice, is crucially important. And the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the UK is from the transport sector. So we had in lockdown that moment where cars weren't being used as much, but it's sort of boomeranged back up to levels again. Looking at alternatives, be it electric vehicles or electric bikes or electric scooters. We have a brilliant article on our website of one of my team taking her 2 kids to school on the back of her electric bike, and it is so popular because people love that idea. It's so much cheaper than having a second car. She whizzes past all the cars stuck in Bristol on traffic. It's got batteries so she can carry kids. It's pretty much what Jack said. It's actually a brighter future when we start to go green. So yeah, I'd say singing the praises of all the stuff you do and love, and tackling the real sources of carbon emissions in your home and transport.
Thank you, Angela. And we'll be putting the link to your website in the chat on YouTube, so people can definitely look for that cycling video. What about you, Kareena? What would your one priority be if you were forced to prioritise?
My priorities are always going to be protecting marginalised communities. So that ensures that there's security for these communities as we move towards a more sustainable world. As you know, as we shut down unsustainable industries, people are going to lose their jobs, and that's going to have a huge impact on just people in general. So the most important thing is, when we move towards green industries and green energy, is that working people will still be able to keep their jobs and they'll still be able to have a good lifestyle. Because what's the point of having a really sustainable world that only affluent people can really enjoy, because everyone else is, in poverty or losing their jobs or on the street? You know what I mean? We need to ensure just not just a sustainable world, but a happy world for all of us to live in. And one thing that I do agree with is that where we can, we should cut down just wherever we can, because a lot of, like, some sustainable practices we can do are actually cheaper. So, for example, cutting out meat in your diet can be, so much cheaper, because fresh meat is so expensive. But at the same time, depending on the situation, it's not always the case. But little things like that can just enrich people's lifestyles, like everyone was saying. And buying secondhand things and selling your old stuff, it's so useful. It's such an easy little thing that anyone can really do.
Thanks. I think that's absolutely right. And Alice, lastly from you, what would your one priority be if you were forced to choose?
Yeah, I mean, to directly answer your question, I think what Angela touched on earlier about making heating more sustainable is really important. It doesn't feel quite as exciting as some of the questions about diet change and flights and things like that. That I think there's a lot of work to be done just in retrofitting people's homes, making sure they're well insulated, and potentially looking into heat pumps and alternatives to gas boilers to reduce carbon emissions there. I guess on a broader level, my priority would be just thinking about how we can make these behaviours that we want people to do as easy and accessible as possible. So touching on what Kareena said earlier, where actually for a lot of people, they might not have the financial resources to always make the most sustainable choice, and they also might just not have the mental space with all the other things that they have going on in their lives and other more urgent priorities to be able to think through every environmental consequence of their actions. So, I mean, I think the role for people like me who work at the Behavioural Insights team is to think about how can we make it as easy as possible for people to eat less meat, choose products which have a smaller impact on the environment, choose modes of travel which are more eco-friendly, so potentially making public transport more accessible or more far-reaching. These are the things that I think about when thinking about encouraging these pro-environmental behaviours.
Thank you. That's great. And we're now going to move over to the live audience. Sonia, have you got some questions for us from the audience?
Yeah, there's a few questions in the chat. So one of the audience members was considering, so I think Angela, you mentioned voting with our money. So an audience member was wondering about investments and pensions and the impact of making sure that our investments and pensions aren't supporting fossil fuel or global arms industries. So can any of the panel speak to that, please?
Yeah, there's depending on how you measure, that is considered one of the most impactful things you can do, is take your money and make sure both your visible money, which is obviously your savings and your bank accounts, but also your investments, your pensions and any shares people happen to have are in companies that are working towards net zero. So I had a renewable energy company pension, and I was horrified when I found out where my green pension was going recently. So there's lots of firms that will help you look into that. It is complex. It is one of the harder things to sort of get your head around. Your bank is the obvious way, just switching to an ethical bank that has obvious carbon policies, but also there's organizations like Make My Money Matter and Good Money and lots of other sort of NGOs that will help you unpick that subject. But basically, if you have an advisor and you ask them and they don't know what they're doing, it's time to get a new advisor on that subject. So yeah, definitely worth pursuing.
Excellent. Sonia, have we got one more question from the audience?
Yeah, so Aurora's wondering, she says, sometimes when I start to think about how to make my life more sustainable, I begin to feel a bit overwhelmed. So how do we face this massive challenge while also considering our well-being and our mental health?
Alice, could we ask you to come back on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question, and I'm sure everyone on this panel will have been challenged with that at some point as people who care about the environment. I suppose one starting point is to know that even though it's an amazing thing to live in an environmentally friendly way, you are just one person. So a slip up that you make, or an area in your life where you're not quite able to do the most environmentally friendly thing, won't be the end of the world, and it won't mean that everything's your fault. It just means that you haven't, quite learned how to adapt your life to that thing yet. And as Jack was saying, living an environmentally friendly life is a really long learning curve that I don't think anyone ever finds all the answers to. So I mean, I think what I would say is treat it as something which you don't expect to just learn all the answers to in a few months. It might well be a process that takes years. You'll learn loads over time. Small changes that you make are good things, but then mistakes and things that you overlook are, because you're just one person. I don't think you need to feel too anxious about. That was my quite personal take on this. I don't know if any other panelists have thoughts on this, because I'm sure we've all experienced this in some way.
Kareena.
I would just like to say I really agree with everything that Alice has just said. Yeah, absolutely. Like we shouldn't. It's a great thing to try and live as sustainably as we can, but we are just one person. So all the small things that we can do, we should treat them as achievements, because at the end of the day, the responsibility doesn't really lie on us. It relies on the government and the corporations. So I think while it's great to be doing all these little changes, the most important thing is to just tell as many people as you can, and that is what's the largest difference. That's what I personally think.
Thank you, Kareena. We're now going to sort of take a step back and look at William's illustrations and see how they're coming along. So William's managed to capture some of that very wide-ranging discussion there. With his pictures, there's money, there's nature, all coming together, and art being used to tell stories. So thank you, William. We're now going to move on and start to talk a little bit more about the wider systems changes that we need, and how we can link individual and community action with more structural changes by government and business, just as Kareena was outlining. But before we get into the panel discussion, we'd like to share a few more videos.
Hi, I'm Rachel and I belong to a tenants and residents strategy group. We are a group of housing association tenants who want to make a difference. We are all interested in climate change and doing what we can to make things better. We want to make a difference and believe we can. But we need the help of our landlord to make a difference. Most of us are living in homes that are now 30 years old. Our idea is for all existing or older homes to be brought up to living green standard. We want them retrofitted to reduce our carbon footprint. We need more energy efficient homes, homes that are healthy and do not waste water, homes with renewable energy such as solar panels. We want gas to be replaced with green fuel, but it needs to be affordable for all. We want local, well-trained people to do the work. Finally, we would like to get everybody involved in making choices which make a difference. More education will be needed. Communities are at the heart of change. Without us working alongside our landlord and other decision makers, nothing will work.
Hello, my name is Syed Ahmed. I'm the Director of Energy for London, a research and campaigning organisation, and also the Chair of Community Energy London, a network of around 30 groups working in the capital delivering local sustainable energy projects. I would like to recommend 3 areas of activities around the delivery of net zero, which will allow for a more equitable and fairer energy transition. One, the need to involve local authorities an awful lot more in energy planning, especially in actions around the electrification of transport, the decarbonisation of heating and the retrofitting of buildings. 2, the need to involve communities much more in helping shape net zero in their local areas, so bringing back a community energy strategy. And 3, recognising the need for a greater granularity around the delivery of net zero by creating local area energy plans.
Hi everyone, my name's Charlene Gandhi and I'm a journalist working at the intersection of business and sustainability, as well as being a food redistribution volunteer working around London. I genuinely believe that business, both big and small, can work to combat the climate crisis. And here are a few ways that business can start to make a genuine, tangible difference. The first is by reframing what it means to be a responsible and sustainable business, and evolving to include things like traceability and economic sustainability for communities all around the world that are impacted by supply chains. The second is to, as a business, start to provide a framework for change that is societal and cultural rather than just at the individual consumer level. And the third is by reframing what it means to earn profit and what it means to grow for your business, especially when we know that we cannot allow for boundless growth within our current circumstances.
Hi, my name is Miranda Schnicker and I work at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. Our work at the Foundation is focused on accelerating the transition from today's linear economy to a circular economy. What does that mean? In short, at the moment, we've designed a linear economy. We take, make, and waste resources. It's a system in which value is being lost. It's also contributing to global challenges, including climate change. 45% of emissions come from the way we make and use products and manage the land for food. These emissions are ones the energy transition cannot easily address. So, what if we reimagined and redesigned our economy from a linear to a circular one, a system in which we eliminate waste and pollution, keep products and materials in use and ensure value is retained for new opportunities, and regenerate natural systems? Business models, product, service, system design all have a part to play in this rethink. And leadership, collaboration, and innovation are key. No one actor can do it alone. We believe business, policy, finance, research all have a core role to play in bringing the circular economy to life, delivering on the Sustainable Development Goals, and creating value in ways that benefit society, the economy, and the environment.
Rachel highlighted the role that landlords can play in reducing energy use by making homes more energy efficient and by retrofitting housing. Zead talked about advocating for energy with local government and communities through local area energy plans. Charlene suggested that businesses need to be responsible, and Miranda proposed moving from a linear to a circular economy. So it would be great to discuss some of these many issues with the panel. Jack, I wonder if I could start with you. What is systems change? Can you explain that to us in a simple way, please?
Okay, well, simply put, a system is just an organised collection of parts that are linked together to accomplish an overall goal. So an example of a system is the human body, our body. So our body is the system, and all of our organs are the individual parts. They're all interlinked together, doing their individual roles to serve the goal of the body, which is to stay healthy and moving and alive. So there are many examples of systems in society. In fact, over the past 100 years or so, society has constructed a whole range of different types of systems to deliver basic essential needs for us. Think of our food, our shelter, our water, our energy, even our education is a system. Now, unfortunately, these systems were developed mostly before we knew anything about climate change and biodiversity loss and environmental degradation. And as a result, although they're very successful in delivering their goals, the food system delivering food, the energy system delivering us energy, they do that at the detriment of the environment and also largely at people as well. So as such, we need to think about how we change these systems so that we provide these essential needs to society, but without creating the environmental impact and the unfair, unjust impacts on marginalized communities and disadvantaged communities around the world. And to do this, this requires systems change. So systems change recognizes that we can't just change one small part of these systems to solve the problem. In fact, we need to change the whole goal of the system. So to give you one quick example, take food waste, for example. It's a major contributor of climate change. We need to massively reduce our food waste. Now, individually, we could today, as a collective, eradicate all of our food waste that we produce in our houses. But that would really only reduce about 1/3 of all the food waste that's actually created in the world. In fact, 2/3 is created across all the supply chains, from the farmers in the fields to the vans that pick them up to the supermarkets that sell them and discard vegetables that maybe look a bit wonky. And so just by us doing our individual action, we can't change the overall problem. In fact, we need to change the overall food system to redesign it so that food is not wasted along the entire value chain. And that requires a lot of coordination and collaboration between everyone that's working in the supply chain, from the farmers to supermarkets to us, all the way through to the government and policymakers and even financiers, to make sure these new trials and ways of working are funded. So hopefully, Sharon, that's a quick example of systems change, and I'll take any more questions if the public have them.
That's great, thank you, Jack. Kareena, Charlene talked about responsible business. How do you think individuals and communities can hold business and government to account?
Well, the most effective way to really do this is by taking it to the streets, really. I think that, in this current time and space, the government really doesn't care that much about climate change. So the most important thing to do is demand change by taking it to the streets, protesting, shouting it out loud. That's the only way we can really get change, I think. And also by running for office and electing people who actually care about the environment, and also by setting up our own little sustainable institutions, because the role that business plays in society is by providing institutions that the government should be providing. So, for example, food banks are one example of it. Some people can't afford to buy food, so food banks will then provide food. And when you think about it, that seems like something the government should be doing. The government's there to serve people. So if we set up more sustainable food banks, and from sustainable sources like growing our own and like having communal gardens and things like that, that's one change that we can do, is really make institutions community focused. And that way we will also be providing jobs for people and overall give people a better lifestyle.
Thank you. So sticking with the theme of community focus, maybe if we can move to Alice. Saeed mentioned local government and Rachel highlighted the role of landlords. How can we promote action, Alice, at the local level?
So yeah, I thought that video was really amazing, and the community that were campaigning for their building to be made eco-friendly is a great example of how people can take local issues that matter to them and feel real to them as part of a wider goal that we all have to ensure a sustainable planet. So to answer your question, I think to inspire people to make a difference, it is important to relate the big picture to their day-to-day lives in a way that feels relevant to them. Because sometimes the big picture of climate change not only feels scary and inaccessible, but also just abstract and hard to get your head around. But smaller scale issues which affect our lives day to day can feel easier to grasp, and we also can see more how we might be able to make a difference to them. So, for example, we might want to talk to people about the air pollution in their local area, what it can mean for their health and their children's health. We might want to talk to people about how better insulation could reduce their heating bills, and really, and also perhaps thinking about how more cycling infrastructure could make their children safer if there are fewer cars whizzing around. So I think engaging with these issues on a local, personal level is a great starting point to first of all get people interested and engaged in a way that feels accessible to them, but then also perhaps start them off on a journey where they can start to move towards thinking about the bigger scale issues and how these might be addressed. So yeah, I think basically local issues can feel less overwhelming. So I might not feel that I can make any difference to deforestation in the Amazon, but I can campaign for lower air pollution where I live. And that might lead me on a journey to campaign on a bigger level as well.
Thank you. So thinking about how people come together for change, Angela, if we could move to you, how can collaborative and collective actions really help motivate and inspire people to get change? And how can individuals get involved in collective action? Angela, it would be great to get your take on that.
Yeah, so as we come out of lockdown, what we've seen is how many habits have changed so quickly due to necessity, but also how many of those habits people actually want to keep. They were seen as a positive benefit. So, for example, in my local city, they have been debating for as long as I can remember about whether to pedestrianise the high street or not. And we weren't allowed to call it pedestrianisation because that was like a red flag to a bull. We had to call it something else, low traffic, something or other. Anyway, so because of COVID, it's happened and it will never go back now, basically. So those changes that happen in the community, when they're framed in the right way and people start to see the benefits, even as a trial or a pilot, once change happens, people can adapt to it. So it's like overcoming that resistance to change. My original career started out in people power in terms of community-owned renewable energy schemes. There are so many projects out there already. If people are interested in anything from food to cycling to energy, they will find a local group of people already out there. And I think the biggest power we have, like we have the technology, we have the knowledge. What is going to make us reach our net zero target is getting the public involved, and the best way to do that is through people's communities and the places where they live. So we'll have like maybe 10% of the population are very worried about climate change and the impacts it's going to have on children and the world, the whole justice issue. But like at least 50% of people love where they live and want to protect that place where they live. So it is in those communities. And the biggest, so we're not economically very savvy in terms of decision making. We do things all the time that don't make any economic sense. But the biggest driver for change generally is peer pressure. So getting our peers involved and what suddenly becomes the norm can happen transformationally rapidly and quickly. And we're seeing that in terms of electric vehicle uptakes now, going from like 1% of the fleet, which is what we have now, to a ban in 2030. And that happened because of how quickly people cottoned on to the fact they were cheaper and a better product.
Thank you. That's great. Jack, if we could move on to some of the things Miranda was talking about in her video. She talked about the circular economy, but what alternative models are there for businesses and supply chains? Do you think you could really quickly take us through some of the key ones that you think will be important?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, it's worth reiterating what Miranda said about what the circular economy is. It's designing waste and pollution out of our economic system, out of our communities. It's keeping products and materials in use for as long as possible and regenerating our natural ecosystems. So that's the basic premise of it. And it offers so many opportunities, not just for businesses, but for individuals and community groups as well. A great example in London is a company called Fat Llama. Bit of a strange name, but essentially they're an online platform where you can share or lease your personal items with your neighbors. And that means, and these are items like very expensive cameras or bikes or surfboards or very peculiar items that you just need to use once or twice, but you don't need to buy them. And that means you can share them with your neighbors. Your neighbors don't need to buy them. You can earn a little bit of pocket change, which is sorely needed right now. And your neighbor can use your stuff, and you're building community kind of cohesiveness at the same time. So that's a really neat example of how we can still live good lifestyles, but consuming less stuff whilst connecting with the community. Another example more locally, I'm up in Scotland, is around whiskey. And, we drink a lot of whiskey up in Scotland, so I feel like I have to give this example. But Scottish whiskey distilleries produce a whole ton of waste grains. Once they've made the whiskey, they just have mountains of these grains just sitting there. And what they're doing now is converting them using little microorganisms, biotechnology, to convert these grains back down into basic carbon atoms and then building them up into chemicals and fuels and plastics, which would have traditionally been made by fossil fuels. So, and these companies can now sell these as really high value products instead of waste to landfill creating methane. So really inspiring and imaginative ways that we can use our materials more effectively, make them last longer and share them with our communities. And hopefully that's a few examples for you.
Some brilliant examples there. Thanks, Jack. And I wonder what William's going to be drawing there. Fat llamas drinking bottles of whiskey. I'm looking at the time and I'm wondering, Sonia, maybe have you got some questions from the live audience that we could bring in, please?
Thanks. So one of the questions is that the climate crisis is already affecting communities across the world, and until now, systems change has actually proven quite slow moving. So how do we communicate the urgency of the climate crisis to government and industry, and on the local community level as well, to make sure that we make meaningful impact and change by 2030 and before the climate crisis worsens?
Alice, would you mind coming in first on that one?
Yeah, so this is probably not so much my area of expertise. I think what I will say is that governments and policymakers are subject to the same kind of behavioural barriers that we are as individuals, where if we see something is likely to happen what feels like a long time in the future, we're tempted to just put it off and not deal with it until the last minute. Which is kind of one thing when it's kind of you putting off going to the gym, but it's another thing when it's the climate crisis. So, I mean, I think governments really do need prompting from citizens and campaigns and think groups to act sooner. And I think it's a great thing that we're moving towards having these kind of interim goals, which are set in law, like the ones that we have in the UK, which helps to prevent government suffering from this tendency to kind of put things off potentially until it's too late. So yeah, that might not have been a very direct answer to that question, but those are my thoughts on it.
Thank you. And would any of the other panelists like to come in on this sense of urgency?
Yeah, I think one of the things that people respond to more is a feeling of loss. And I would say politicians and corporations already know, they have been told many times what the impacts of climate change are. I don't think the public is aware how bad it's going to be. And so, for example, I spent an hour on the phone today with a lady whose house is literally falling into the sea at the moment. And their neighbourhood, their village has been listed as one not worth saving in the government's coastal erosion and sea level rise strategy. So it is getting those stories out, which is why we spend so much time working with the media here at One Home so that the impacts that are already with us, be it like the horse chestnut tree, the conker tree as we know it, is the most popular tree in the UK in terms of public opinion, and that is one of the many trees under threat from pest and disease at the moment. So it's taking the things that people love and highlighting what the risks are to them, to the things we love, that can put that sense of urgency, because we've got the solutions. What's missing is the urgency to act, and the idea that being forewarned, you can be forearmed. So if you know this is what the impact, this April will be the driest April on record, potentially, the impact that has on farmers is something that doesn't really impact us because we go to the supermarket and buy our food. But if that link is made apparent in both the reduction in yield and the increase to your food bills every day. So for example, chips are generally an inch shorter 2 years ago because of the drought that we had. And then I was able to tell that story to EastEnders writers who were going to try and put it into the fish and chip shop in EastEnders. So looping that round and putting it into the public where it impacts people's lives daily is really, really important, and something we haven't yet started to do.
Brilliant. Short chips, a call for action to avoid the short chips. And I wonder if we could, Sonia, are there any more questions, or should we ask each of the panelists to come back with a summary?
There's just one about someone's interested in just knowing more about initiatives to combat climate change on the community level, but many of you have sort of mentioned, so perhaps you could also touch on that in your culmination.
So I wonder if I could ask everyone to, in a 1 or 2 sentence summary, to really summarise their main recommendation for systems change, and particularly pulling in this point about community, how we involve communities in systems change. I wonder, Kareena, could we start with you?
Well, I don't really have one sole recommendation, but I will say that we won't be able to really achieve change without calling for change and then setting up our own sustainable institutions. So by doing both is really how we get the result. You can't have one without the other, basically.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kareena. Alice, what about you?
So I suppose from a behavioural perspective, what I would say is that we don't just want to put pressure on individuals to change their behaviours to more environmentally friendly ones. We need to redesign systems and processes so that it feels easy, intuitive and natural to make choices that benefit the environment.
Thank you, Alice. And Jack, what would your main recommendation be?
I think mine would be for us to collectively demand a new goal for our economic system. Currently, our goal of the economy is to pursue infinite growth. This goal will ultimately lead to catastrophic economic collapse, ecological collapse, and dire social consequences. And as long as the economy has this goal, to be quite frank, it doesn't matter what our communities do, because this growth and the impacts of this growth will overwhelm these positive contributions. So instead of how much better it would be to pursue new growth, what about pursuing an economic system which delivers human well-being within the ecological boundaries of the planet? And so one takeaway I would say is go and read a book called Donut Economics by Kate Raworth as a crash course, read up on it, and write to your local MP and demand this reset, and tell them you won't vote for them unless they push for it.
Thanks, Jack. Time for a reset. Angela, what would your main recommendation be?
So obviously check out One Home's top 10 tips, because that's the sort of most impactful things you can do yourselves. Never doubt the impact you can have. I watched a program on BBC One about Greta Thunberg yesterday. I don't know if any of you saw it, but that girl continues to amaze me of how incredible she is with what she's done as a small teenager, the impact she's had. So never think you're too small to make a difference. And thirdly, find an organization that fits your passions, basically, because if you're with like-minded people and you're enjoying what you're doing, it doesn't feel so much like pushing water uphill. It feels like riding a bike, electric bike downhill. The Climate Change Coalition is a great organization that lists all the charities working in this field. So maybe check that out and find your tribe in there, I would say.
Thank you very much. And thank you all the panelists for your brilliant recommendations and tips there. We're now going to go back to William to see how throughout this discussion his illustrations come along. So some really good visuals there. Looking at William's illustration, it reminds us that we began the conversation talking about the actions that individuals can take and what our impact as individuals on the people and planet is through the things we buy. And William's illustration of the global reach that we can have through our mobile phones and the power of our purse is very vividly portrayed there. But we also recognise that we need to understand people's experiences and the practical and psychological barriers people face and address those specifically, making it as easy as possible for us all to make changes. As Alice said, we've got busy lives, we've got other things going on. But buying less, buying secondhand, eating less meat, cutting our footprints, raising our voices and demanding change are all important. And doing that with a view to protecting the interests of disadvantaged and marginalised communities is vital. We also heard that art can be a way to make connections and to tell positive stories and make something beautiful out of waste so that we really understand where things come from and help us, and art can also help us reimagine the future. We then talked about why do systems change and how to provide essential services in society like food and transport without adverse environmental or social impacts, such as through a more circular economy where we design waste out of the system. And we use that to encourage responsible business for the future and to think of different ways to promote collective action locally. And I think the last recommendations there are about starting local and being as tangible as possible so that people link in with their neighbours and in the process develop richer community relationships has come out really strongly today. So I'd like to thank everybody, William in particular for his fantastic illustration. This event today has been part of our wider series of events. We've got 2 more discussion events coming up, which include one on the next one on the unequal impacts of climate change. And following that, we've got one on the role of technology in engaging people in the climate crisis, and then one on examples of climate leadership. We're also hosting a conference on social and cultural change and the climate crisis on the 21st and 22nd of September later this year. And this will be far more interactive with breakout groups so we can really hear your views. So do watch out for our website for more details of that. We're also delighted to let people know that last week we launched the 2021 Sustainability First Art and Essay, Art and Writing prizes. And these are also on the theme of Together for a Fair Climate Future. So please do apply and share your creative visions for the future. We think creativity is so important as a way of getting through the climate crisis. Look on our website and do find out details about how to apply there. So I'd like to end by thanking everybody for joining us today, for watching and taking part in this event. Thanks in particular to our fantastic panel. They really shared some really great ideas, some practical tips and visions for us all in terms of how we can live more sustainably. And thank you to our video contributors. They've really given us a rich and very varied context from which this discussion needs to happen. And thanks again to William for his fantastic drawings. I'd also like to thank my Sustainability First colleagues, to the whole team for pulling this together, and particularly Claire and Alice and Sonia and Janine, who've done a sterling job. And lastly, to thank National Grid, who've sponsored and supported this work and have enabled it to take place. We hope to see you again for our next event, and that's on the 11th of May, and it's on the unequal impacts of climate change. So do please join us then, and have a good afternoon. Thank you.